we have this idea of Buddhism being this religion of ascetics.
Exactly, yeah.
But the spread of Buddhism is along the trade routes, and it's often the merchants who are... Merchants like Buddhism because they can give money to...
So they have a capitalist twist to Buddhism.
There's a massive capitalist twist, which is a huge surprise.
No, that's correct, because Chinese and Japanese interpretations are, well...
Today you have in corporations people greenwashing. They're spending money on sustainability to try and give their corporates
I like that term.
a good image.
So cynicism in that term. You greenwasher.
So you have the same sort of thing going on. These merchants who, like any capitalists throughout history, are busy doing probably a whole variety of terrible deeds to make their money, can simply give an enormous trench of their fortune to some nice rock monastery outside Pune, Karla or Baja or Bedsa. Now suddenly have a line of pillars saying, Mr. Vishnu from such and such a place, or so-and-so the merchants of Sopara, or the...
So they're buying this, their fame through the spirituality
they're
connection
buying their
thing.
salvation.
Oh.
So that's a great deal. But it's more than that too, because the early Buddhist monasteries lend money, and they are the first banks in India.
Is this correct?
This is correct. I haven't made
I hope you researched this properly, William, because you and I will be on a trip to Beijing. Finally, I'm going to get a history lesson, which would cost me about 5 crores an hour for
Only
free.
5 crores an hour? Come on.
William Dalrymple, I am giving you a rate which is acceptable by my people. Okay, GST included, VAT included, all that and more. What a pleasure it is to have you here.
Great pleasure. I'm a big fan.
Of who?
Yeah. Well, I'm old enough to have seen you when you were slim and good looking enough to be on MTV.
That's embarrassingly insulting about how old I am. Thank you so much, William. Thank you. We have met a couple of times before. We've done a podcast through the other medium during the pandemic, I think,
Absolutely.
Around that time.
But never sat down and been recorded in this manner before. This is a exciting new development in our relationships.
And you can see we're recording this on a Sunday, and everyone's so happy to be here. We've dragged them all out.
You should have seen the grumbles as I was entering the building.
Yeah. But you seem very happy.
I enjoy being in Bombay, actually. I have to say, I love it. It always makes me happy to be here.
Speaks volumes for Delhi.
Well, Delhi I love, and Delhi is my first love, despite everything. Yeah. But at this time of year, it's not much fun. It is very, very, very bad pollution that makes
I just read.
your haze look like a sort of positively benign.
It's just amazing, really. Is it really that bad?
It's that bad.
Yeah.
It's really nasty.
Wow. Yeah. This is why the Mughals left in the end?
It isn't why the Mughals left, but it's why quite a lot of other people are moving to Delhi.
Timur was like twice more than enough. Can't breathe. Out. Yeah. All right, let's talk about the Golden Road. You're doing a book tour, so there's a lot of repeat questions going on.
As I say, I'm slightly anxious psychologically that I still enjoy answering the same questions day after day. You sit on, a book like this takes at least 5 years, and you sit on your own for 4.5 of them doing your stuff, and then suddenly everyone shows an interest. Normally it's just your family nodding off during meals, hearing you.
But William, the question to ask you here is, for 5 years, if you're working on something, but you don't have like a day job, how do you get paid? How do you survive?
Well, that's why I'm on a kind of 3-month book tour, because these books can absolutely support you. But
support you for the next 5 years.
But you have to work hard for it. No, so the answer is you have to find a subject which will not only sell in India and in Britain, where I'm from, but also in America, Australia, Italy, and every other big market. And that way you can make a good living still, actually, from these.
Every 5 years, just like the government, you hold your own and then come back. Exactly. Come back or not, we'll find out. We're in the middle of Maharashtra elections as we speak. Keep that aside for a second.
Let's not go anywhere into that.
You're not neutral. You're a Delhi boy. In a sense now.
I'm a Delhi boy. I have been for 40 years.
Yeah, you're just racially from another country, but you're basically an Indian.
Not even racially entirely from another country.
Where the hell are you from? Scotland?
I do have all sorts. I'm Scots, but I have a trickle of Franco-Bengali blood from Chandanagar.
From Chandanagar?
From Chandanagar.
Edinburgh. Where's this province?
And I have a trickle of Mughal blood also.
Oh my God!
Be
careful, they'll rename you.
I'll suddenly become Shivaji Dalrymple.
Can you explain that? How?
Sure. No. So it's something that interests me and something I've actually written about. A book called White Moguls, one of my first history books, was all about this. We all grew up with this idea of the British, like Kipling and Curzon wearing solo topis, entering clubs which Indians are excluded from, and operating on roads from which no dogs and Indians allowed. We all seen those movies and the documentary.
Anything, I hate the signs where they say no dogs allowed. The rest I'm a little iffy.
But in the 18th century, most Brits were cohabiting with Indian women. And the evidence of this is...
What's changed?
The evidence of this is the wills of the East India Company servants, which they had to send home because the East India Company got involved in so many lawsuits. Your family are lawyers. You would have been involved in some of this.
We kept it in our pants, though, I'm told.
But in the 18th century, you get all these claims by families back in England, imagining that their little Johnny has made a huge fortune in India.
No pun intended.
And it turns out, of course, that he's penniless and spent it all living it up. And so the company had this rule that you had to send a will back to London, which they kept in Leadenhall Street, in the East India Company headquarters. And every single one of these wills survived. So you actually hear, if you look through these wills, what people are actually up to, not what they're supposed to be doing, but who are they actually leaving money to. And in the 1780s to 1800s, 1 in 3 Brits is leaving everything to an Indian woman or an Anglo-Indian child. So there was a massive amount of intermarriage. In my family, who were Scots, and so we came from one of the poorest countries in Europe, and we arrived here, and Scotland, as a whole, moves from being the kind of second poorest country in Europe to being the kind of second richest, thanks to the joys. No, thanks to India. Which was,
wow.
The Scots love to portray themselves, and we get a lot of mileage out of this, as you know, the kind of Mel Gibson character shouting "freedom," and we imagine ourselves to be fighting the English bravely on the battlefields throughout. In reality, we were the biggest collaborators in the empire. That most of the Brits, certainly a disproportionate number of the Brits in India were Scots, because they came from a really poor country and they wanted to.
So where's the Chandrapur connection?
So Chandanagar, there's a very beautiful woman who is half Bengali, half French, and she marries a guy called an English guy called Patel, and their daughter marries my great-great-grandfather.
Wow. So you're 129,000
yes,
Bengali.
Something like that. But it's there.
But if there's a football match somewhere in India, you get excited.
Exactly.
There's got to be something in the DNA.
And then there's another guy who is based down in Hyderabad in 1800, and he marries a woman called Muti Begum, who is the daughter of the Nawab of Masulipatam, and turns out to be Nur Jahan's great niece.
Oh, nice.
So we have a bit of that. So there's 2 of these.
What's that? How are you connected there?
I'm the great-great-great-great-great-grandson
of Muti Begum.
Of Muti Begum. So I got a direct line. I mean, it's again 1/29,000th or something, but it's there.
This isn't
bizarrely. I was at the Kasoli Lit Fest 2 weeks ago and ended up meeting this guy who is now a commandant in Hyderabad, and he's located the grave of this guy. And it's sitting there still in Secunderabad in the cantonment, and on one face it's got his name in English with all the nice things that he did as far as English goes. On the back is a second inscription in Persian, his wife's language, recording a whole completely different order of events as seen.
It's totally different.
Totally different.
Yeah. Different cultures, different viewpoints, exactly. Perspectives change, context is sometimes
and that
different.
is so interesting, isn't it? The same thing happened during the Mughal period too. There's a very distinct moment when, I can't remember which of the Jaipur Maharajas, but whoever it is it Man Singh or Jai Singh? Man Singh, I think, gets appointed by Akbar to be the head of the Mughal army in Bengal and Bihar. And in the big fortress that he builds, he puts up 2 inscriptions. And one of them is in Persian, and it says, Man Singh, the humble servant of Akbar the Great, who cowers
which Akbar can read.
Yeah, exactly.
The other one?
And then the other one's in Sanskrit, and it says,
vegetarian food,
Man Singh, the big swinging guy.
Yeah, beautiful.
And no reference to the Mughals at all. Cower before me, wretches, all this. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
So this is an old story. People put out different accounts.
It's globalization of the world, which people don't think of actually. I think in the States as well, people start looking at this 23andMe, this DNA test that you can do, and you find out very Teutonic-looking people who have a lot of black blood or Hispanic blood, this and that, and the fact that
the most boring results though are Parsis apparently, because you're the only people
and Irish
who are 100%.
A lot of the Irish, Irish and Parsis. Nobody interbred there. I'm sorry, we did interbreed. That's the problem.
Interbred. Exactly.
I apologize.
I have a friend who is Parsi from Bombay, and she sent her spittle or whatever it was off to the DNA people. 99.9% from Yazd.
That's so sad. There's no action outside the area of confinement for thousands of years.
I have Jewish friends who've got the same thing too.
Yeah, that's
entirely Jewish. Or
that's the stereotype of these two communities, the looks, etc., come through from that. But let's get on with the book before they tell us it's over. The Golden Road is the name of the book, and lots of questions that I have. First and foremost, the Golden Road is, I first thought it would be the Rotang Pass or Khyber Pass, but it goes back. We're going back to pre-Buddha, etc. And what is it? It's a metaphor of sorts? Or?
It's a metaphor of sorts. It's a coinage, in a sense, to take on the Silk Road, which has now become this famous thing.
Which the Chinese have hijacked.
And, well, it's not just hijacked, invented, really, because I think everyone now, because it's in such common usage, assumes that the Silk Road is a term that's been around forever.
Yeah. Hasn't it?
No. 1877. It's invented by a German geographer called Baron von Richthofen. It doesn't enter the English language till 1936, when a Nazi-sympathizing Swedish explorer writes a book called The Silk Road. And that is literally the first usage of it in history.
What was the Chinese definition?
So the Chinese were, in a sense, slightly late on to this, because it was a lot of Europe. When I was at college, I did a journey following Marco Polo along this route, and I used that term very, very happily. But it was a kind of fairly fresh term in the 1980s. And you were beginning to see in Istanbul Silk Road carpet shops, and in Uzbekistan the Silk Road cafe, and this sort of thing. And it's been used by everybody because it suits lots of people. It suits the person who's selling the carpets, or it suits the Chinese tourist board or the Uzbek tourist board. It sounds romantic. It also suits academics, because you can apply for funding from Chinese foundations. And
can non-Chinese apply?
And well, this is exactly the
Mr.
problem.
Jinping?
It is something which is reinvents the idea of these ancient trade networks that were incredibly diverse all over the place, as something which was always facing China. The Silk Road inevitably leads to Xi'an. And it also privileges silk, which is a nice material. But
this is the starting point, right?
But both of these are fantasies. That there's no
silk.
There was silk, but the idea that was the great export from the east to the west is nonsense. And the fact that all trade routes ended in Xi'an
is rubbish.
Is rubbish too. And in reality, particularly in the early period, and this is the reason the book is called this, by far the bigger centre of east-west trade is India. And it's not at all on overland. Well,
Padma Shri, Padma Vibhushan, Padma Bhushan, Bharat Ratna. You've already won some of them.
There's all sorts of things which that lot will not like about this book. For example, the first half of the book is about Buddhism.
Hey, you want to tour Shanghai also.
and hang on. And the second thing is that it has two whole chapters about the greatest Hindu empire ever.
Ashoka. Chandragupta.
No, the Khmer Empire, which is not part of...
Khmer, Cambodia.
Far larger. Khmer has conquered...
Is it part of India?
From Angkor Wat. No, never. But they were Hindu. And the Khmer Empire conquered not only Cambodia, which is the centre of it, but most of Vietnam, the whole of Laos, 3/4 of Thailand at its peak. And I think you could certainly make an argument that the greatest Hindu empire Ashoka's Buddhist.
But didn't he go that far?
No. Ashoka goes from Kandahar to the Deccan.
Okay.
It's a long way. It's a big empire, but it's a Buddhist empire.
Then Samudragupta, Vikramaditya, one of them must have gone further.
So anyway, the point is that that there's this whole world that we've forgotten of Indian influence. And on one hand, there's the whole story of India's enormously valuable trade with Rome. Rome and India were the biggest trading partners. there is a historian called Strabo who lived in first century Alexandria, goes on a tour of Egypt with the new governor of Egypt, the Roman governor, and he sees in the Red Sea port of Myos Hormuz 250 vessels waiting to sail to India when the monsoon winds turn.
Wow.
So there were these enormous fleets passing directly from
so we were
Roman
trading
Egypt.
Rome and Calicut. Where would we go?
Particularly, Kerala, Muziris was the ancient port, Barigaza in Gujarat, and Barbaricum in the mouth of the Indus, where Karachi is effectively today.
Oh, nice.
And these were enormous, enormous trading fleets. And using the monsoon winds, once people learnt to just put up a sail and let the monsoon blow
Take you, yeah.
this is like a turbocharge. You can get there in 2.5 months from Kerala.
This sounds like an Indian thing. We'll save money, wait for the wind.
Well, it is.
Yes, our side, not the Italians. We got that right.
And then you see what is even more wonderful about the monsoon winds, and which is why India's always been this trading nation, why you've always got Tamils who are always ending up in Burma or Myanmar, and why you've got Gujaratis all over East Africa.
Yeah.
These winds blow you, but they also reverse in 6 months of the year. So how it works is that Tibet freezes over now, and cold winds blow in. Then in the spring it thaws, and hot, warm winds blow out. And this is what creates the monsoon that disrupts your life every year in Bombay, but which nonetheless promotes this incredible. So no other country has this thing where you can just put up a sail and blow very fast in one direction.
We're
for 6 months
wasting
of the
so
year.
much money in transport, and you've come up with this idea, fellow Indians, desis, suno, meri baat. You have to go out there, catch the wind going this way, catch the wind coming back, right? That's it.
And that's it. And that's what Indians did for thousands of years. And no other country has that, where you can just, it's free and it reverses itself. As soon as, remember your literature classes, Cleopatra. Cleopatra puts the asp on her breast.
But it's 100%, is it, I mean...
Whatever. She commits suicide, certainly, to avoid
Lucky
being
asp.
captured. Yeah.
No, from a historical perspective.
No.
Sorry, William, before we get cancelled. That's asp.
I don't want this to be my last.
I'm quite the asp on myself, yeah.
So Octavius Caesar, later Augustus, takes over Egypt. And Egypt is effectively got a sea border with India. It's only 2 months sailing. So from that point, the largest trade network in the ancient world are the fleets going backwards and forwards with the monsoon winds. And there's a new document being discovered called the Muziris Papyrus. It's real Indiana Jones stuff. I got very, very thrilled writing this, which shows that your ancestors were grossly overcharging my ancestors for Indian goods. So things like pepper, which you just gather off a vine.
Well before the East Indian Company, we were doing our own thing.
It was the reverse. The East India Company is all about Brits ripping off Indians. But you guys were well at it by the Roman period. So,
what can I say, William Dalrymple? Guilty as charged. Well done, boys.
and this went everywhere. I'm born in southern Scotland and grew up there. And there's a Roman fort on Hadrian's Wall called Vindolanda, where they found these little fragments of inscriptions where there's some poor guy called Blackso or something who's spending 2 denarius on a little black pepper to try and spice up his Roman dinner as he's facing my wild Scottish ancestors. So it spread all over the Roman Empire. Everyone wanted pepper. Everyone wanted ivory, which is another major export from here. Everyone wanted cotton, which we talk about silk, but we forget that cotton is this other great Indian export. And what this Muziris Papyrus shows, it's an extraordinary document. It's just one shipping invoice of a sort that gets made out in Bombay presumably every day in the shipping offices. But this is for the mid-2nd century AD, so it's about 120. And for some reason, this particular papyrus has survived in the desert on a rubbish dump somewhere. A place called Oxyrhynchus. These things don't get rained on and they live forever. Anyway, it's now in Vienna, and it shows that this one container, which contained about 2 tons of ivory.
Oh my God.
Some enormous number of amphorae of black peppercorns, a lot of cotton, something called nard, which is the basis of perfume.
Not gonads.
Not gonads.
Well, that actually, could be
it may not be an entirely different part of the body, but
we don't know. History is grey. Yeah.
Anyway, nard was used in Roman perfumery and was very, very expensive. Anyway, this one container on the ship called the Hermapylon, which happens to leave Kerala around 120 AD,
God,
if this one container sold for as much as the invoice is made out for, then the importer in Alexandria would have been the Elon Musk of Roman Egypt, because you guys were charging so much money.
Can you put it in modern terms? The cost of
the modern equivalent is you could buy the largest estate in Egypt or central Tuscany and have left
for just this.
This is a big
for
container.
The shipment,
But if this shipment had got successfully through, avoided the pirates, avoided shipwrecks, somehow made it to Alexandria, this guy, and we see the result of this because there are villas, for example, in Sicily where you have pictures of a personification of India, this sort of busty woman looking like something out of a Bollywood.
I'll keep quiet.
You just keep quiet.
I shouldn't say anything. Every time you open the doors there, we cross the Rubicon.
We seem to be wandering along the Rubicon rather than
yeah.
Anyway, from this
busty woman,
and it has busty woman. Behind the busty woman is a tree with peppercorns. She's covered with silk, which is deliberately shown to be transparent, so you can see her limbs beneath it, which is something the Romans got very titillated by. And why
also,
they liked
probably
silk.
A male sculptor.
It's a very male picture. Yeah. Then you've got another thing which I haven't mentioned, which is circus animals. So the Romans were taking tigers and lions and elephants from India and putting them in the Colosseum. Gladiator 2 out this week has got a rhino in it. That could have come from Kaziranga, as far as anyone knows.
This is a horrible Genghis Khan story we have come to at some point.
That's another
much
rhino
later,
story. There was this enormous trade, and which we've totally forgotten. And so there's not in reality, and this is the thing that really excited me, there is not a single embassy from the Chinese to the Romans that we know of, nor an embassy from Rome to China. There is not a single trading expedition which
at
we
this
know,
point,
at this early point, between Rome and China. And yet you have everywhere these maps of the Silk Road. The Silk Road, I think, was a thing in the Middle Ages. Marco Polo, after the Mongols, smashes a hole through Asia, and there is this motorway running between the Mongol capital at Xanadu or Beijing, right through to the Mediterranean. But in the Roman period, they literally didn't know each other's existence, while with Rome and India, there is this enormous fleet. So there's a real story to be told here, that we have been looking in completely the wrong frigging place for where the trade was taking place. So that's one story. The next bit of the book is all about the spread of Buddhism, which is the most successful export from India ever.
Stronger outside than inside, in a sense.
Well, not initially. Initially, it's the major religion here too, under Ashoka. And in a few generations, Ashoka sends out these, what he calls Dharma ministers, out, according to an inscription in Kandahar, as far as Cyrene, which is Libya. So you have all these guys going out. There's a big fuss about missionaries in this country now, but Indian missionaries were going right across the Mediterranean.
But it's not by sword. It's...
This is a very important point. It's not by the sword. And a lot of the Hindu nationalist historians of the 1930s over-egged the pudding. We're talking about Akhund Bharat as this sort of big, muscular Indian empire. What's really interesting about it is, as you say, it's not the sword. It is a peaceful... people are so excited by the stories in the Mahabharata or the Ramayana. The kings have so much to gain by becoming Hindu kings, because they're suddenly now the friend of Lord Shiva or Lord Vishnu, not just a local strongman. Plus all these Brahmins turns up and gather their taxes for them, administer their accounts and all this. That you find Hinduism spreading all over Southeast Asia. You have Buddhism spreading not just to Southeast Asia, but to China, Korea, Japan, Siberia, Mongolia. And it's the greatest Indian export of this period. Everyone over this whole trench of the world buys into this. They like the stories. They like, no one wants pain. Buddhism tells you how to avoid pain.
I can't resist saying this, and please forgive me. A little cheaper than the old shipping, No,
and it doesn't cost anything. Though actually, this is important. We have this idea of Buddhism being this religion of ascetics.
Exactly.
But the spread of Buddhism is along the trade routes, and it's often the merchants who are... Merchants like Buddhism because they can give money to...
So they have a capitalist twist to Buddhism.
There's a massive capitalist twist, which is a huge surprise.
No, that's correct, because Chinese and Japanese interpretations are, well...
So these guys offer merchants today you have in corporations people greenwashing. They're spending money on sustainability to try and give their corporates...
I like that term. So cynicism in that term. You greenwasher.
So you have the same sort of thing going on. These merchants who like any capitalist throughout history, are busy, doing probably a whole variety of terrible deeds to make their money, can simply give an enormous trench of their fortune to some nice rock monastery outside Pune, Karla or Baja or Bedsa. They now suddenly have a line of pillars saying, Mr. Vishnu from such and such a place, or so and so the merchants of Sopara, or the.
So they're buying this their fame through the spirituality
they're buying their
thing.
salvation.
Oh,
so that's a great deal, and you find that it's more than that too, because the early Buddhist monasteries lend money, and they are the first banks in India.
Is this correct?
This is correct. I haven't made
I hope you researched this properly, William, because you and I will be on a trip to Beijing after this. Yeah.
No, it's really interesting. You have records of early Buddhist monasteries siting themselves often in estuaries, with stupas up on a hill. The merchants can steer their way home. They then give a gift because they've made it home. They repay their loan.
Wow!
And quite often also the monasteries, again, contrary to our impression of early Buddhism, they have slaves. And they...
And you were worried about my breast remark? This is much more dangerous.
They have slaves, and they often have mines. So I was last week, this time last week, I was in Malaysia at a place called the Bujang Valley. And I was with the archaeologist, Dr. Nasha, who's digging this site. And the stupa is bang next to a massive iron ore deposit. And
it's like there's a flourishing business.
It's a total business. And then there's another one which I visited in Afghanistan a few years ago, a place called Mezainak, which is in trouble now because the Chinese are about to move in, because that is next to the world's largest copper deposit, which the monks also exploited. So you have this interesting nexus whereby merchants are traveling along the trade routes. They're giving money for monasteries to be founded. They're paying. Often it's sort of crowdfunding. You find these little inscriptions, like in Sanchi. It says the main gate at Sanchi, which is in every Indian history textbook. It says paid for by the ivory workers of Vidisha. So you've got these little inscriptions that give these hints, and cumulatively you get this picture of a religion which is attractive to the merchants and early capitalists of India, whether they're craftsmen or whether they're tradesmen or whether they're long-distance merchants selling goods over the trade routes, and they're subscribing to Buddhism, and the Buddhist monks are moving along this route with them. And it's early Buddhist.
So it's a whole trade that's going on with the religion,
and that's how it works. And that is particularly how this Indian religion, Buddhism, gets to China.
The untouchable area of the world.
It's not untouchable. This is again what's interesting. I mean, today we think of China, as you say, as this untouchable
as a
place,
lockdown nation,
and a knockdown nation that hermetically sealed, like a sort of Tupperware. That, you can't. Far from it. At this point, you have Buddhism arriving along these same trade routes, and by the 1st century AD, there's a significant population of foreign Buddhists in China. It takes off at court. By the 6th century, it is the religion at court. And there's 2 wonderful characters in my book who are responsible for turning China into a Buddhist nation. Again, this is we don't think of this because we forget sometimes that Buddhism comes from India. But the Chinese convert to an Indian religion. The penny needs to drop it sometimes with us, because
we're much closer than people think. I mean, really.
So there's 2 extraordinary stories connected with this, and these 2 people were friends and allies. So the first is someone who does appear in Indian history textbooks. Next one, Huan Shuang. As he used to be called. The Chinese now pronounce him Xuanzang. Xuanzang.
Good.
It has an X at the beginning. And Xuanzang is this sort of scholarly Chinese monk who's worried because he's a clever guy. His granddad was the rector of Beijing University, the Xi'an University. He's worried that there's corruptions grown into the Buddhist texts used in China. So he decides, I'm going to go to the source, which is, in his year, the incredible ancient Buddhist monastery at Nalanda in Bihar. Today we don't think of Bihar necessarily as the center of world scholarship.
No, we don't, but I get your point. Everything is Bihar. Pataliputra, I mean, all of them, the Tirthankaras, the great kings,
And so he makes this 6,000-mile journey across the deserts, and he has all sorts of... He's nearly sacrificed Durga Puja at one point.
What?
Literally.
We have Bengalis in the room here. Be careful. What the hell were you guys doing?
I don't blame them personally for this. But anyway, he finally gets to Nalanda. And you get this extraordinary description, both from his own pen and of his slightly later biographer, Hu Li, who was a young guy who was a hero, worshipped him, who wrote this full biography of Nalanda. 9-story library. They teach, I mean, obviously it's a Buddhist monastery, so they mainly teach Buddhism and particularly Mahayana Buddhist texts, but they also teach the Vedas, logic, mathematics, astronomy, astrology, a whole range
and the banking system.
I don't know whether they teach the banking system, but they're certainly supported by merchants. And we again have inscriptions from Nalanda showing that the merchants are paying for some of this stuff. And Xuanzang, after whatever it is, 3 years of travel in appalling conditions, nearly killed, nearly sacrificed, nearly ambushed, or ambushed twice but never quite killed, makes it. And he is wide-eyed at this place. And he regards Nalanda like some of the classical accounts in the West regard the Library of Alexandria as just the
greatest,
the Oxbridge, the Ivy League,
Which it was, right?
Which it was. It genuinely was. You don't have to sort of make this stuff up or inflate it. All the texts show that not only Xuanzang was coming from China, but you got a copper plate from the king of Srivijaya, which is Indonesia, founding a kind of expat college for Southeast Asian monks. Other guys are coming from Nepal, from Tibet, from Sumatra, from Japan, from Korea. So this was really, I mean, this was more than Harvard. This was a unique and extraordinary... And so this guy who spends 20 years there, he copies out.
And then he goes back.
Then he goes back. And then there's an extraordinary twist in the story. And just as he comes back when the great Tang emperor, who's called Taizong, who's this sort of a figure a bit like Ashoka.
I like the way William tells me the names like I'm going to recall them. He just throws it at me now.
You know, you've got it recorded. You can just rewind.
Yeah, I know, but what if you ask me again now? Repeat the name.
Anyway. Taizong is this old guy, and he has, we're heading along the Rubicon again here, a 15-year-old concubine called Wu Zetian. And Wu is a piece of work. She uses the opportunity of Taizong's death, and the crown prince moves into his apartments to seduce the crown prince. Normally, all the concubines and wives of one emperor, not killed, but they're put into a nunnery at the end of this.
They go straight into a nunnery?
And Wu spends a year in nunnery, and then the crown prince brings her back and makes her the top concubine, which is totally taboo. Then there's an extraordinary moment when she gives birth to the new emperor's son, and 6 months later, the baby is found strangled.
Oh.
There's an investigation, and all the finger of suspicion points to the empress and to the rival chief concubine having killed this baby. So they are put on trial, they're found guilty. Both of them. Their bones are broken, and they are drowned in a vat of wine where they take 3 days to die. Horrible description.
But some would say if you had to, I mean, wine would be the last.
It may not have been sort of Mouton Cadet or one of the better vintages.
It could be worse.
We'll pass over that. And so Wu becomes the empress. Then the emperor has a series of strokes, mysteriously, and Wu becomes the effective ruler. And then, and this is a bit of, I think
she kills him.
I don't think, well, it's not clear, but certainly she gets to rise. Then he dies, and Wu becomes the only female emperor in 3,500 years of Chinese dynastic history. And there's effectively a Buddhist, Indian-led coup d'etat. And these guys called the Scholars of the Northern Gate, who are this sort of right-wing think tank that she's been cultivating, suddenly emerge and announce that she is the reincarnation of the Bodhisattva Maitreya. They produce all these texts from the Diamond Sutra and the Lotus Sutra about how this Devi has been prophesied for centuries. So for 40 years, this woman rules, using Nalanda-trained, sometimes Indian, sometimes Chinese, but Chinese have been to Nalanda. And they take over the whole of China, and China becomes a Buddhist nation. The Confucians are sidelined, the Taoists are sidelined.
William, this is based on a murder. So this will be the first Wu done it. Thank you.
I'm going to borrow that.
Off you go.
It's very good. Very impressed. So you haven't just spent your days working out, Cyrus. I'm glad to see you've kept your mind active.
Read the odd book. Some clever moments.
It's very good. That's very good. Anyway, so this is, if you like, is the high tide mark of Indian influence in China. Never again, right up to the present, will Indians be so influential at the center of Chinese politics. And there's all these guys. I mean, you look at the records of the court at this period during the reign of Wu Zetian, and you have someone called Gautama Siddhartha, who
Indian names,
Indian names running the local astronomy, not the local.
But so these are Indians with Indian names, or
these are Indians
Indians
with Indian names running the court astrology bureau, running the observatories. And I mean, it's not. I don't want to over-egg it. It's not as if it's an Indian takeover, but they're there, right at the centre of things. And there's a common thread of all these guys having been trained at Nalanda in India behind this. So it's wheeled back in generations to come. The Confucians get back into court, the Taoists get back, and Buddhists remain an important but not the controlling element. But it's an extraordinary moment.
Wow. It's a real global text, actually, the way you mention it, you know. I mean, Nalanda reaching out from where it is and taking over, not taking over, but spreading itself through an empire which was unreachable, in a sense.
When you go to the National Museum in Delhi, they have there this copper plate of this king of Srivijaya. I mean, it's a long way from India. Srivijaya is based in Sumatra.
Indonesia,
Which is what, 5,000 miles from India? 6,000 miles?
I'll have to Google it, William. I'm not that smart.
It's a kind of 6-hour flight from Delhi, anyway.
Yeah, it is.
It's a night flight, you know. Yeah.
Air India 7.
Even it doesn't take off. Unless we're now with Vistara, we may see.
After all the India love he shows, he goes and takes off on the air.
I've been in an Air India flight that caught fire, which is, and I literally have not been back in Air India.
When?
This was on a flight back from Khajuraho about 10 years ago. And,
really?
And
nobody died.
No one died. There was a fuel leak before we took off, and they
par for the course.
Well, it's one of the most terrifying. This is a detour, but it's worth telling the story. It's a good story.
Yeah.
So we all got sort of shoved off the plane, obviously, because of the fuel leak.
Yeah.
And I was just leaving. I rang up my travel agent who got the last place on the train to Delhi that night, and just about leaving when they called us back. Well, it's mended, all sorted out. So we get checked back in, bags back in, sitting there, and the guy behind me, there's a guy in the seat. I can hear him doing the Hanuman Chalisa.
Oh no, not a good sign. Not a good sign.
And it's the freaking engineer with his son.
What a horrible story!
This is a completely true story. And so I asked, what's up? And he said, well, Jugaad. and they, I don't know, they've used lawnmower parts or something to mend this fuel leak. Anyway, it's one of those hopper flights.
The plane fly?
Well, presumably to sort of stop the fuel pouring out. Anyway, we take off, and it's one of those hopper flights. It lands in Varanasi, no problem. Takes off, and I know something's gone wrong because I fly into Delhi every other week, and we're landing somewhere very weird. There's no lights. In fact, I can't even see Delhi out the window. And
so there's no announcement.
And the minute that we touch ground, the red light goes on. Evacuate, evacuate. And there's this smell of, you can see flames flickering. The undercarriage has caught fire.
Wow! Because
the fuel has leaked again. And I'm actually in the exit row. Have you ever been in the exit row when their hostess comes around and says you might have to? So anyway, I'm actually in that seat.
You paid attention.
And so I pull the thing down, and two things happen. First of all, I'm covered in water because they've surrounded the airfield with fire engines. Thank God they did, because they know this is happening, so they're ready, and they parked us in a field somewhere on the edge of the airport. But the chute doesn't come out, so I'm looking out onto the wing, and it's pouring wet because thankfully the fire engines are there, and wondering, do I actually jump onto the wing? Because the chances are that you're going to,
Mission Impossible,
slip off, and then I'm not Tom Cruise, and whether or not the plane blows up, because I can still see the flickering on the tarmac of the flames. I'm almost certainly going to break a leg or do my ankle in at the very least. So I decide, you weigh up your chances, and I decide to queue with the others for the exit. So by this stage,
people were panicking.
By this stage, the air hostesses were panicking, which was quite frightening.
Horrible.
It's not a good sign.
Oh my God, that's terrible.
And by this stage, all the kind of foreign tourists got out at Varanasi, and it's just some MP farmers, and they're all told not to bring their kit, but of course they brag their sacks and everything, so it's plugging up the aisles. And it felt like about 3 hours, but it can't have been more than 8 minutes. And you know that the plane could blow up or catch fire seriously. You can smell the burning of rubber. You can see outside the vague flickering lights. But that said, the whole outside is being swished by fire engines. So you're hoping for the best. So I queue. Eventually, because I'm in the exit row, which is absolutely in the middle of the plane, so you're choosing between the two longest queues, I get to the front, and it's a chute. But because, again, all these fire engines are sloshing water everywhere, you go down the chute like a accelerated, and at the bottom, I never forget it, were all these false teeth and glasses of all the old farmers sitting in the.
We shouldn't be laughing, but visually it's terrible. Yeah. But I mean, it's funny.
I literally have not travelled Air India since that.
But we have to take a break, William. You're talking too much. I can't control you anymore. And also, you've called me a shoot twice. I've noticed. Did you hear the word shoot came out twice, which is Scottish that was the Delhi lingo. Yeah,
I did not call you a shoot. I went down the chute.
Down the chute. Yeah. Okay. We'll be back in a second with William Dalrymple. Stay where you are.
Hey, it's been another great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On Cyrus Says, Cyrus and Gajraj Rao discusses Dua Lipa's SRK moves, Vikrant Massey's retirement, Pakistan's ICC model, Aditya Thackeray's bold remarks. On A Century of Stories, Kunal reveals the fascinating history of India's first commercial airport, the Juhu Aerodrome. On Paisa Vaisa, Anupam Gupta talks to Satish Mehta about his journey and expert tips on managing credit and improving your credit score. On Century of Stories Cricket, Cyrus Brocha and Nishant Tanwar shares hilarious stories. Folks, if you like our show, spread the word. Tell your friends and don't forget to rate and review them wherever you're listening to them. Follow us on social media. We are IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram and LinkedIn. You'll also find all our shows on YouTube by their show name, so do look out for them and have fun watching. And finally, we would like to thank our sponsors this week: IDFC First Bank, Axis Mutual Fund, SBI Mutual Fund, ICICI Prudential Mutual Fund.
All right, we're back here in the middle of a story. We had to take a break, but he's telling us a story of travels and travails of aeroplane flying, plane flying.
The plane did not blow up. Luckily, the fire engine was there. But of course, being Air India, no one came to rescue us. So we're standing on the runway for about 45 minutes. But eventually, one of these sort of trailers that carry baggage turned up. So we all pile on that and go to the. And thankfully, we had all brought our bags. We weren't allowed back on the plane, obviously.
Yeah. Where were you?
And then it took about another 4 or 5 hours for the luggage to turn up on the belt. No explanation, no apology, nothing. And by the time that we get out of the airport, there's a whole team of reporters with.
What was your experience like, Mr. Dalrymple?
Well, I said, very glad to be alive.
Yeah. What were the other irate passengers? They didn't scream and shout?
I think we were all scared stiff. It wasn't really a question of being irate. It's a question of, thank God, we're here to tell the tale.
Wow.
No one was angry.
Now, see, if you just follow the winds and left from Calicut at the right time, boom, you'd have reached Delhi.
There's a few other problems with shipwrecks and things.
So I wanted to ask you a question because we rushed through that period in a sense. Ashoka, didn't he also get a bit of a bad name? Some historians talk about the fact that maybe he did all this for publicity and he realized that Buddhism was, a popular way to push his name and legacy, etc.
So there's various versions of these stories, and I think it's the Sri Lankan chronicles, he's this person who he's turned into this sort of demon who converts and becomes a sort of angel. And that there are other stories like that. For example, in Buddhist mythology, there's this yakshi called Hariti. Well, she has this bad habit of eating children, which is not to be recommended. Yeah. And then she meets the Buddha, and she becomes a vegetarian. And And so she then becomes the kind of Buddhist patron saint of children. So when you see pictures of Hariti in Buddhist sculpture, she's surrounded by tumbling children. So it's that sort of thing. And there is this whole trope in Buddhism of someone who is
switching from one end to the other. The paradox.
So the Sri Lankan sources about Ashoka are quite late. And so some historians say that this is not.
But what's your educated guess? Because of the politics of the world, it's all difficult to think of people as spiritual, 100%, etc., etc.
There is another theory that put out by Sanjeev Sanyal that Ashoka was a Buddhist when he made these great massacres in Kalinga. And that idea is also out there. The truth is that...
Already? He was already a Buddhist before Kalinga?
That's the Sanjeev Sanyal line, and whenever I give a lecture and mention this, I'm always asked questions about this. I have questioned the real specialists on the Mauryan period about this, Upinder Singh, and she says that the chronology simply isn't clear enough. We just don't have the sources to answer that question. What I have to say I'm very struck by, having studied quite a lot of ancient history, and compare, for example, Darius in Persia and Cyrus, your Zoroastrian forebears.
The most benevolent of all kings. Mention him again.
Well, actually not, because when he's a rough contemporary of Ashoka, a little bit earlier.
Yeah.
And when he is showing himself in his inscriptions, he has...
that bit is correct.
Yeah, he has his...
Glorifying
He has all these guys who are these other kings with halters around their necks in the Behistun inscription. And it's all, Darius, king of kings, the most powerful, big swinging guy in the
You mentioned that standing on the heads of the...
Exactly. And what's striking is Ashoka does what kind of no one else in world history in politics has ever done, which is apologize. It is a weird thing. It's an unusual thing. I mean, even today, you don't find our ministers in my country or in your country going out of their way to say sorry about stuff.
No, never.
And yet here we have this inscription of this guy saying, I screwed up. Yeah. I created complete havoc. I destroyed 1 million people's lives. And he goes into some detail.
The numbers I mentioned,
But not just the numbers, but he says, when you declare war, it's not just the people you kill. People are displaced. Families are broken up. Some are enslaved. And there's a long paragraph about all the terrible things that happened during a war. And so I had to say, if you ask me my educated guess, it's by no means certain, because this is, in a sense, a ruler putting out a piece of propaganda, and so therefore we should be skeptical when any politician tells you how virtuous he is. Get your bullshit meter out. But there's nothing else like this in world history. It is a unique moment where a ruler is saying, I really screwed up, I'm sorry, and what I suggest we do is this now. I've read all those other accounts, and there is no final answer on this because we don't know, and the sources are very vague for that period, and we really only have Ashoka's own edicts to go from. But they are sufficiently weird and unique and idiosyncratic to lead you to think this guy is rather
actually went through a change of heart.
Yeah. So I mean, we don't know, and and certainly you can put the counter argument equally strongly. Yeah. But if you ask me for my hunch, I think it's odd enough.
But does he wage war again after that or not? That's another.
Well, no, and that's in a sense why the one thing he does say is he goes after tribals. And he says that he doesn't like the people of the forest people, as he calls them, and he says that if they continue to create trouble, he'll have to go after them or something. So there's a clear threat of force.
Okay, so there is that. So there is that rider.
Yeah, there is that rider. So it isn't, and history is full of violence, and the history of India is as full of violence as everywhere else. We sometimes have this image of particularly pre-Islamic India being this
really
sort of
pious and we don't hurt anyone.
The more you look at the inscriptions, particularly, for example, the Cholas were incredibly violent coming out of Tamil Nadu, and the Chalukyas are so irritated by this, they put out all these edicts of their own, saying what kind of Brahmins is it that rape women? And that's there from the 11th century. The Chalukyas have put out the counter evidence against the Cholas, saying these guys
not so holy
are
as
incredibly violent. Yeah. And equally the Sri Lankan chronicles, because both the Pallavas of Tamil Nadu, then their successors, the Cholas, attack and conquer with varying degrees of success Sri Lanka. And you have these descriptions in the chronicles of temples being destroyed, idols being dismantled to take the jewels, and all this sort of stuff. So it's very important, I think, to
So that
realize
narrative doesn't belong to
everywhere-
only
yeah.
Islamic invaders. But we don't seem to.
I mean, there's no question that the Islamic invaders
Did that.
were extremely violent,
Yeah.
but they were not kind of unique in that, and that you get violence and rape and looting of temples in pre-Islamic India as well as during the Islamic period.
All right, I want to ask you one more quick question because we have to get back to the second half of the book. And that is another thing which drives me nuts because I'm big fan of, not fan, but followed Alexander's life. So what happens in the jail in the Battle of the Hydaspes? Because all the Indian historians insist that it's either a stalemate or he loses. But everything else is like he's clearly, you know, and then Seleucus is left behind and he goes ahead and, you know.
So, well, I think the trouble is we don't have sort of neutral sources for this. We only have Alexander's sources. I don't think there's any reference to Alexander at all in contemporary Indian inscriptions.
No, there isn't. But the historians of today have come up with.
Sure. So Alexander says that he defeats Porus in this battle, but equally it is significant that after that battle, Alexander's troops refused to go on, and the Macedonian chronicles say they're far from home, B, it's raining, it's the monsoon, everything's damp. But you could also read it as, we're not going to fight any more of these guys. That battle against those elephants, that's the last time we're doing that, Alexander. Yeah. So it's possible to read, it was a victory, but such a costly victory that
Porus keeps the throne.
Well, Porus A keeps the throne. According to Alexander, he's reinstated. And the troops refuse to fight again. So you can read that in different directions.
So again, educated guess, Mr. Dalrymple?
If I had to put my money on it, I'd have thought. I mean, he was. These guys were clearly the business on the battlefield, the Macedonians. So it's probable they did win the battle, but equally,
they couldn't take the country anymore.
It was an extremely hard-won fight, and the fact that they decided to turn back and have enough must be significant.
Good point. Let's get back to the book, Golden Road. So that's
Alexander does appear in there. There's this brief moment when
I read that bit. I read that bit. Yeah, we'll never know for sure. But the fact of the matter is, perhaps, like you said, at the very worst, it's a sort of a stalemate where the Greeks say enough.
And certainly, what you find is that when he is going down the Indus to find the sea to sail back to the Middle East, he gets a arrow. The only time it happens in his calf in Multan.
Yeah. This is where he charges alone, right?
I don't know whether he charges alone, but he certainly gets hit.
Nobody follows him into he climbs the thing on his own.
Which again leads you to believe that these guys are no pushover.
Yeah.
No, I think there's good evidence that the Indian armies were extraordinary at this
Multanis, now in present-day Pakistan, but we're all friends. Yeah, fabulous story. All right, so there's the Buddhist half of the story, and then it goes on.
It does. And again, it's an extraordinary story. The spread at the same time that Buddhism is spreading right up to Siberia and Mongolia, there's this extraordinary spread of not only Hindu kingship and Hindu texts, but the Sanskrit language. And you get this moment in the 7th or 8th centuries when Sanskrit is the language of every court between Kandahar and Bali.
Really?
And not for the common people, but for the diplomatic language, the educated class, everyone is subscribing to this. What happens initially, my understanding is there's two things going on in the 5th century that begin this process. First of all, it's the Gupta period. So the Guptas are spreading their culture everywhere, and these guys are rather amazing. This is the period of Kalidasa. It's also the period of the Kama Sutra. It's the period of...
Just go back to the Rubicon. You just have to say...
Also... it's the period of Aryabhatta comes up with the direct circumference of the Earth, the distance between the Earth and the Moon, the fact that the Earth spins its own axis. These are quite big
things. How did you do that?
How indeed. He says, I used the boat of my own knowledge to find the lost treasure of knowledge. Or something. My intelligence to find the lost treasure of knowledge.
Spoken idioms and similes, so we don't know what he's saying.
But trigonometry is the answer. And
you're looking at the wrong person. I like history, I like art, but I have no interest in maths.
So the maths, I also am no mathematician, and I find the maths really quite interesting because this is the period when also Brahmagupta comes up with the idea of zero, or zero as a number.
Oh, zero is not Aryabhatta?
Zero is not Aryabhatta. Brahmagupta, a generation later, comes up. Well, what Brahmagupta comes up with is a definition, or a series of definitions
Shunya.
of zero. Exactly. And he takes that concept, which is there already, shunya, and he says, what is zero? And he says, then he puts out a series of rules. So zero is the number you get when you subtract a number from itself, and then various other rules.
So but my wife thinks of me as well, so.
What it means is that you have zero not as a placeholder, not as an absence, not as a vacuum, but as an operative power like other numbers. And this gives zero its power. So it means that you can have place value, tens, hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands. You can do all these fancy tricks with trigonometry and binary systems. It's the basis for everything else. And it's such a obvious idea to us because we know it, but it's one of those great abstractions of human thought that before that it hobbles all mathematicians who don't have it, including those in the West. There's no zero in Rome and Greece. So once this idea is out, it spreads. But anyway, let's go back to the Southeast Asia, because in a sense the maths is the third part of the story. Let's save the maths at that point. So Gupta India is spreading these ideas around. But another very important thing happens is the fall of Rome. And as we've seen, the Indians have become incredibly rich on selling at an inflated price, ripping off my poor ancestors on Hadrian's Wall and others. Pepper, ivory, animals, perfumery products, cotton, all these things going for vast prices, to the point that it becomes a matter of pride in Rome to have fancy Indian luxuries. And there's a story of one of Nero's mistresses, Lolina Paulinus, who not only covers her hair, her breasts, her lower body, her shoes with Indian jewels. She even brings the receipts to parties to show people in a very sort of Bombay touch to the whole story.
By the way.
And you have Pliny, who's this naval commander, complaining that decadent Roman women are draining the country of its wealth because they want to wear this see-through material silk. They want to put this pungency on their food.
So we brought down the Roman Empire in our own way.
So you didn't bring down the Roman Empire, but you did drain them of their wealth and rip them off.
Subsequently,
So what happens is that the Roman Empire falls eventually, not due to India, through other reasons. The Huns come pouring into Anatolia, the Goths cross the Rhine, the Vandals come and sweep through Spain and end up in North Africa. All this complete chaos for a century. And this creates a total economic catastrophe for India, because Indians have been used to run like Saudi Arabia with its petrol. They can just, they have to sit at home and just pump out the
Send
petrol,
the silk.
and here comes all the gold. India's like this in the 5th century. Suddenly, the Romans are no longer there. The ports have disappeared. There is no money. And suddenly, there's no gold turning up every year for free. So at this point, the Tamil merchants guilds, who are badass guys, these guys have this sort of trading confraternity. They have their own mercenaries, they have their own ships, and they have even, and this is a nice detail that my friend Anirudh Kanasetti came up with lately, he found they've got a corps of assassins, so that if anyone goes after their...
Insurance?
It's good, isn't it? Yeah. So these guys pivot. And they've been facing Rome and the West Coast and the trade for all these different things we've been talking about with the West. Now, in the 5th century, they have to find new sources of gold. So where do they go? They go to the place that they begin to christen Suvarnabhumi, which is Southeast Asia.
Oh.
And particularly Suvarnadvipa, which is probably Sarawak, where there's gold mines, which in the Ramayana, Sugriva tells Hanuman, you just kick the ground and gold dust appears.
Yeah.
And in a lot of the Jataka Buddhist tales, the stories of princes going to look for gold. So there are these gold mines in Southeast Asia. And from the 5th and 6th century, we begin to get little Tamil inscriptions turning up around them. One guy, very sort of nice little story, it's a gold worker who calls himself, and he writes this little inscription on his touchstone, which he uses for making his gold jewelry. He says, I am the greatest gold worker in the world, or something. That's all it says on the thing, but it says it in Tamil, so we know that this guy with a big head
paid for his PR.
Yeah, exactly. And so you get all these merchants now going. There'd always been trade with Southeast Asia, but it had been relatively unimportant compared with the enormous wealth coming in from the West. Now suddenly the whole place
switches there.
Switches. And it's the East Coast. It's ports like Nagapattinam, Mamallapuram, south of Chennai, all these sort of places.
I'll struggle to repeat these names, but he tells me like I'm his brother.
And then there's also, of course, the trade from Bhubaneswar and Orissa, which they still have the Bali Yatra to this day, where they go out and commemorate the sailings to the south. And then an earlier version of Calcutta called Tamralipti, which is on the Hooghly.
What's it called?
Tamralipti.
Tamralipti.
Yeah.
Wow.
How
do you do this? I mean, they're not even, they should be foreign to you, all these words. They're foreign to me.
I spent 5 years incubating this and thinking about nothing else.
That's
so
true.
Anyway, suddenly it's the East Coast, and you have, in the 5th century, the first signs of little wooden Buddhas turning up in the waters of the Mekong Delta. People fish them up. Small images of Lord Vishnu that you can hold in your hand. I was literally this time last week, I was in Malaysia, a place called Bujang, the Bujang Valley, gorgeous place. And there they found these very early temples built in stone. The trading settlements have gone because they were built of wood. But the Brahmins and the Buddhists built at least the foundations of their temples. There was wooden superstructures, but the foundations are in stone. And they're still there. And there you're finding yonis and lingams and images of the Buddha. No, it's all right.
Didn't mean to laugh.
Keep calm.
He went straight there. I'm sure there are other things that we would find as well. Yeah.
But they are there. And in Bujang, it is only Shaivite temples. There's no Vaishnav. But in the Mekong Delta, we suddenly get lots of Vishnu temples. And we have the records of Chinese ambassadors who are a bit pissed off at this point because they turn up and they find there's all these Indians there. And suddenly, not only are there all these Indians, everyone's beginning to speak Sanskrit.
So Southeast Asia was like Heathrow.
So
it's just enter and the Indians everywhere.
Punjabis. Always Punjabis. And they complain about this. They say suddenly, the king it used to be called Kodunga or something. Now he's called Mullavarman or Suryavarman.
An Indian word.
A Sanskrit word.
Sanskrit word.
So these guys, we have to sort of ask, what's in it for everybody. So for the Brahmins, they get given a princess, a nice estate, and they're welcomed and treated with great prestige. For the local rulers, these guys are bringing literacy, which doesn't seem to have existed in Southeast Asia before, numbers, and basically tax gathering skills. So they're welcomed. And so what they're offering the ruler, not just, you're suddenly not the local strongman, but you're the friend of Lord Shiva, the friend of Lord, but you also how to gather and administer taxes. So it's a really good deal for everybody. Everyone's doing well. And then we get this whole layer whereby the whole of Southeast Asia embraces Sanskrit. I mean, you and I know that it's not an easy language to master. But when you look at the inscriptions in the Khmer in Cambodia, they are perfect. There's not a single grammatical error. And there's thousands of these. And you get the impression that these guys are getting as nerdily into Sanskrit as sort of Parsis in the 19th century got into Shakespeare or Jane Austen. Or
Shakespeare's easy. Sanskrit.
Yeah. But so you get this real nerdy sense of guys who are very proud of their Sanskrit learning. And, for example, there's an incredible, beautiful small temple outside Siem Reap. Everyone goes to Angkor, which is also astonishing, and enormous, but it's very famous. This little one is less well known, and it's just the Prime Minister's private chapel. But what is really fascinating, I think, is that you get this idea that this guy just loves Sanskrit literature. So he's not just got the stories of the Ramayana, the obvious ones like the Battle of Lanka. He hasn't just got the Mahabharata and the big stories like Kurukshetra. He's got the kind of weird little tales that you forget about Ravana doing this, or the burning of the forest, and then beyond that, weird little Tamil folk tales that you don't even have in Andhra Pradesh or Karnataka, but here they are in Cambodia. And this guy's showing off the fact that he knows all this stuff. He's got libraries full of these texts, and he's really into it. And that is the key to it, I think. When you go to Edinburgh, where I'm from today, you walk along Princes Street, and there's the path, a little miniature path, which is the National Gallery, and then there's another version of it behind. Now, that's not there because Agamemnon conquered Scotland. It's there because the 18th century Scots so loved their Greek literature that they built Edinburgh again. The new town of Edinburgh is the idea is it's the Athens of the North. It's all built in this very classical Greek style. And they did a nice job. It's a gorgeous. All the nicest things in Edinburgh are from this period.
So what you're saying is all by choice.
This is by choice.
Taking in the Indian culture.
They take in the culture. They go to school. They read it. They fall in love with it, and then they want to reproduce it. So it's not that India conquered this. It's not a sort of chess-beating Akun Bharat where Indian warriors reduced them. It's that the stories were so good.
It's the subtle Indian way.
You tell good stories.
Yeah.
You know,
great stories.
Yeah, great stories. There's nothing.
None of them made up.
Well, that's a different matter.
Listen, William, we're running out of time, so I need to just get to the. Well, I don't want to give away the book. The book is there. They can go and read it. But the story carries on.
So the third part, yeah. So first part is Buddhism. The second part is the whole story of Sanskrit and Hinduism in Southeast Asia. And that is a big deal. That not just Cambodia, but Indonesia, Laos, Vietnam, all take on Burma.
Indian overtones.
Indian overtones. And again, it's quite important to emphasize that the person who actually gets it right is Tagore, who goes to Angkor Wat in about 1920. And he says, everywhere I could see India, but I could not recognize it. And what he means is it's slightly different. And it is.
It's their own spin.
It's their own spin. So, for example, in Southeast Asia, there's no caste. Everyone eats pork. They carry on eating pork despite the fact they're Hindu. And you have women Brahmins officiating in the royal temples, which again is a different thing altogether. You don't find that here. Plus you get the local emperors putting their own face on statues of Lord Vishnu or Lord Shiva, which you don't get here. It's blasphemy. So there's a whole different thing going on. And at Angkor Wat, at the central tower, that contains the ashes of the founder, Surya Varman. Again, I don't know any temple in India where you get the ashes of the founder sort of enshrined like a stupa. So it's not exactly the Hinduism that we're used to here. Although Hinduism here, of course, that varies between Bengal and
exactly.
And
that would happen anyway, right?
Yeah.
Because there'll be cultural, influence from the other side as well.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
So it's not a surprise, but it is something different. And that's quite an important thing. It's not just a carbon copy; it's its own spin.
So it becomes its own species, so to speak.
Which is why when you go to Bali today, it's a very
Bali.
different form of Hinduism with all this sort of rice offerings and nice little sort of.
You feel there's India feel to everything in a sense, but you're right.
But you cannot recognize it.
Yeah,
as Tagore said.
Yeah.
So anyway, the final thing is maths, which you and I are no good at. And we're going to make a fool of ourselves talking about.
Although we like figures.
Ding ding, Scots, Parsees. Yeah.
Hey, it's called males.
Anyway, so maths. So the Gupta period comes up with all these ideas. The interesting question is how it then passes on. And in this direction, we're talking westwards now. It does spread also to Cambodia, but in a sense that's no surprise because everything else has spread to Cambodia too. Mm-hmm. What is a surprise is how it gets first to the Arab world. The West knows these numbers that we all use as Arabic numbers because we got them from the Arabs.
Oh, that's right.
But the Arabs didn't invent them, they got them from you guys.
Hindu-Arabic.
Hindu, that's exactly the right term. Yeah. So that's what scholars call it. So what happens is, bizarrely, there's a Disney character at this point in the story who turns up. I don't know whether you've ever put your kids in front of Aladdin.
Of course.
Yeah. And remember Jafar, who's the slightly creepy-looking...
The bad guy.
Indian, the bad guy.
Yeah.
So Jafar is actually a historical character, and he wasn't a bad guy. He's actually a rather amazing guy. He's the vizier of Harun al-Rashid, the Abbasid emperor of Baghdad.
Yeah.
And he, in reality, is the fourth generation of this family, extraordinary family called the Barmakids. Now, the Barmakids are originally from Afghanistan, and they were Buddhist abbots.
Who converted?
They converted to Islam, but they had all studied Indian math. And one of them, Khalid ibn Barmak, had actually gone to study not just Indian math, but at the center of Indian mathematics, which was Srinagar.
Really?
So this guy is sent on his return as a hostage to the center of the Arab world. He makes friends with the son of the caliph. He also makes friends with the guy that will lead the revolution of the Abbasids. And he becomes effectively Al-Mansur's Indian accountant, doing the clever sums.
Figures. What we're famous for.
What you're famous for, and what you were famous for.
Without
then.
being racist.
Without being racist, and or alluding to The Simpsons or anything else. This is
modern day soothsayers.
So these guys make such a good job of leading this revolution that when the revolution is over, the Caliph Al-Mansur says, build me a city. And this is Baghdad. And he builds it in the circular mandala Indian model.
Oh, is that it?
That's literally it.
Wow.
And the first thing these guys do when they come to power is they send a mission to Sindh, which is the nearest Indian kingdom just over the Indus. We want the works of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta. And this is the point where things become very clear because we know all the details. There's 776, I think. This text, which the Arabs called the Great Sindh Hind, turns up. And your mathematicians in ancient India didn't make things easy. They wrote their maths, not only was it very complex and in Sanskrit, but it's in Sanskrit rhyming poetry.
Ouch.
Bizarrely. So it takes a couple of generations for the Arabs to translate, unravel all this and translate
Again,
it.
Yeah. Be careful what we're saying here, but it's just because it's difficult to understand.
Yeah, it's really complex stuff. And there's a guy called Fazari makes the first translation, which is not a kind of big success. But a generation later, a guy comes from a place called Khwarazm.
Yeah,
now, Khwarazm is what we today would call Khiva in Uzbekistan.
Yeah.
But because he's from there, when he arrives in Baghdad, he's called Al-Khwarizmi. And he finds all these texts, and he has this incredible talent to simplify this complex stuff and make it instantly comprehensible. No poetry, just simple Arabic prose.
He dumbs it down.
That teenager doesn't dumb it down at all, but he makes it comprehensible. It's not the same as dumbing down. It's making it that people can understand.
I dumb things down.
But it has everything, but a teenager can understand it. And the text that he writes, he gives this long-winded title. It's called The Book of Completion and Balancing According to Hindu Calculation. No one, even in Arabic at the time, wants to call this important book by that massive name. So they give it a nickname, and that nickname is algebra.
Algebra.
It's the word we have for algebra.
So it's an Arabic word.
It's an Arabic word. And then his name, Al-Khwarizmi, gives the word algorithm.
What are you saying?
So this vital moment when your Disney character, Jafar, brings this text over, it's translated by Al-Khwarizmi, and we get the word algorithm and algebra, and it spreads like wildfire. It spreads not just across the Arab world, but as far as Spain, which is the. So suddenly you've got this relay race. You start with Aryabhatta, who's in Pataliputra, Patna, in Bihar. Brahmagupta comes up with 0 is in Rajasthan on Mount Abu. That spreads to Sindh, and it's the Sindh court that takes it to Baghdad.
Wow.
Al-Khwarizmi translates it into Arabic, and it passes right through to Spain
and Europe.
And the first European scholars come across this in the 10th century in a monastery near Barcelona called Ripoll. And we have the first versions of the numbers we all use today in this monastery in the 10th century.
The 1, 2, 3.
The 1, 2, 3 that we all... Because you've got to remember that before this, everyone's using Roman numbers. XV, CLV, C, rubbish like that none of us can understand today. And it's a much more complicated system. And try doing long division in that. It doesn't work. But nonetheless, despite the fact that few scholars are onto this, amazingly, Northern Europe still clings on to its Roman letters right into the 12th century.
Scandinavia.
But, I mean, the whole of Mediterranean Europe, the whole of Christian Europe. And so Aryabhatta's 6th century, 5th century, 6th century. It reaches Baghdad 776. It reaches Spain by the 10th century, but as late as the 1100s, the whole of Italy, the whole of Germany, the whole of Britain and France still doing MCM, VX.
Is this why we're much better at maths than all the Europeans?
Well, there's a whole... We can come to that later.
Fair to say.
So, and then there's a freak occurrence. The trading city of Pisa on the Italian coast, where the Leaning Tower is, all that, around the time the Leaning Tower is built, in fact, before it started leaning, they found a trading colony in Algeria to try and exchange goods with the Arab world. And this guy who's in charge of it brings his kid. And they sent him to the local school. Like my kids went to school in Delhi and learned Hindi. So this kid goes to school in Algeria and learns Arabic and Arabic math. That kid, luckily for us all, is Fibonacci. And Fibonacci goes back home and finds all his friends are trying to do long multiplication of MCMVX divided by CCMVV. And he thinks these guys need help. So he writes something called the Liber Abaci. And the Liber Abaci is the book which basically brings this system to Europe.
Brings them on par.
But then there's another improbable twist, which I like very much, which is a Scotsman, I'm glad to say, turns up in the story improbably at this point. Even more weird than that a Disney character brings it to the Arabs. The Holy Roman Emperor, who controls Pisa and the whole of Italy at this point, is a guy called Frederick II. And he's an incredible guy. He's the kind of the brightest European ruler of the whole of the Middle Ages. He's corresponding with the Arabs on all these things. He's open-minded. The Pope excommunicates him because he's too sort of clever for everyone's taste. And he hears about Fibonacci. And he comes all the way up from Palermo with his giraffes and elephants and his court mathematicians. He's a very showy sort of guy. And they have, do you have countdown in this country, the maths quiz?
We used to.
Yeah. So they have a sort of countdown.
Now we have countdown for the country.
They have a sort of open air countdown. And Fibonacci, because he's Fibonacci, wipes the floor, wins the top prize. So then he's called to a lovely geometrical castle called Castel del Monte, which is still there. It's perfect geometry, 8 octagonal towers, octagonal shapes. And there he meets the court astrologer, who's a Scotsman called Michael Scott. Michael Scott left Scotland long ago, went to Toledo, learnt Arabic, became this great sort of expert on astronomy and astrology. And he reads Fibonacci's Liber Abaci, and he says, Paul, it's great, but it's a wee bit theoretical. And what I suggest is that you put in money, conversion, weights and measures, double accounting, all that practical stuff, converting currency. So Fibonacci is humble enough to actually produce a second edition of his Liber Abaci dedicated to Michael Scott, which has all this in, and that's the stuff that gets the it's incredible. It starts the Medici Bank. It kickstarts a lot of the Renaissance painting. Somebody called Piero della Francesca, who's my favorite Renaissance painter, comes along and writes 3 texts based on Fibonacci, which then pass with his friend, a guy called Friar Luca Caroli, to Milan, where he shares it with his flatmate, who's called Leonardo da Vinci.
What are you saying?
So all this stuff, all starts, So it's a long relay race, and so I think this is the most fascinating story, and it just, in a sense, we've always, when Indians want to be proud of ancient India, they often come up with all sorts of nonsense about atomic weapons and the Mahabharata or helicopters,
macho, chest bashing.
The true story is actually so amazing that you don't need to make anything up. It's all there. It's all incredible. And weirdly, it hasn't been told for, this kind of A.L. Basham's Wonder that was India, written in, 1954?
You're asking me like I'm your expert. Okay, 1954, June 15th, I'm pretty sure. But, William...
But no, it's weird, because here we have this government that, prides itself on India first and all this stuff. And no one, anyway,
sorry, but we really have to stop because you've gone over our 1 hour
7 hours.
17 minutes. And as you can see, the non-historians in the room are going berserk here. But let's just get to the point here, which is, the book is called The Golden Period. I'll pick it up in a second. Go and buy it to understand.
The Golden Road.
The Golden Road, the Golden Road. What did I say?
The Golden Period. What were you thinking?
I said Golden Period. See what you've done to me? What have you done to me? I was an innocent young man.
Where did that come from?
I was in Baghdad. I was learning maths. All right, listen, we have to do this quickly, which is AMAs from fans who are fans of yours. Kazillion says, what are your thoughts on Scottish independence? Yes, they voted, presently, remain in 2014. But with Brexit and Scotland being in favour of the EU, do you reckon we could see another referendum in the near future with a different result?
So my personal view is that we've been running the English very successfully for about 300 years. If you look at recent Prime Ministers, Blair was a Scotsman.
Really?
Brown was a Scotsman. Cameron is a Scotsman. They're all Scots. And so I don't think there's any need for us to stop running the English. I think we're doing it very happily. So I think it would be a mistake, is my personal view.
But you're a Scot living in Delhi, so the views are a little different than a Scot living in Scotland.
Yeah, no, but we voted against it last time for good reason. Not because we love the English, but because we
you're
do
already
very well.
in charge.
We do very well.
Yeah. Iceman11, historian, says, how do you feel about being labelled a pop historian? Was the recent criticism of your work by Indian academic historians and your critique of theirs fair? Do you think that their perspective comes off as a bit of smarty pants club thingy? Lastly, can academic history be written in a way that's engaging and accessible? That you have done, so we won't get into that. But what is this pop historian nonsense?
So I said something in the Indian Express in an interview.
Clickbait.
Clickbait slightly.
Yeah.
It wasn't intended as such, but it turned out that it was. And I said that the reason that we have all this WhatsApp history going around with WhatsApp uncles sending out nonsense to everybody is partly because for many years, right up until between about 1950s and I know the turn of the century, Indian historians were tending to write only for themselves in complicated language. So I've had no negative reviews from Indian historians of my work ever. I've always had very, very nice reviews, but they didn't like that criticism. And there was a lot of comeback on academic Twitter about whether it was a fair criticism, saying that, and then many people saying that Indian historians do now write for the general audience, which is true, that now there is. But for a long period there wasn't. That was the point I was trying to make. I don't describe myself as a popular historian. I think every historian should try to write rigorously scholarly and clear, academically sound history. The question is how you express that. And I don't think it's necessary in most cases to write it in academic jargon. That if you're talking about human beings and human experience, which is what history generally is, it's quite possible to express it clearly in a way that's accessible to the non-specialist.
This is what Fiduci did.
Well, I mean, lots of people do it. Yeah. It's only in India that it's a remotely controversial thing. It seems to be quite obvious that you can. There's nothing wrong with scholarship in its own right. Scholars talking to each other, that's fine. If that's what you want to do, that's great. But it seems to me we do have a problem in this country with the growth of mythologizing of history. And because history is taught very boringly in schools, lots of people don't like it and don't read history. And I think everywhere, not just here, but everywhere, it's really important to reach out and to write clearly.
You're a communicator. You're communicating.
Well, I mean, it's not just me. There's lots of people that do this. And there's a lot happening. I mean, there's both within and without academia. There's not a divide that says that you have to. Academia is all about teaching, and it's a great profession, and we all owe our things to teachers who taught us. And I'm sure everyone in this room and everyone listening will have had some great teacher who inspired them at some point in their life. But you don't have to teach to write. And what's the prerogative of every historian is to write accurately, rigorously, but I would say also if they can possibly write clearly, engagingly, and in nice English, that's a plus.
Yeah.
That's my point. Anyway.
Yeah. It's why Sanskrit lost its charm and Prakriti became more popular, but we've really run out of time. It's been an honor and a privilege to have you here.
Fun. Sorry,
a fabulous discourse that you've given us. You almost abbreviated version of a huge book here in just an hour and a bit, which is fantastic. The one and only William Dalrymple. Go and buy the book. It's called The Golden Road, How Ancient India Transformed the World. Last word on the subject. What he's trying to say here is that there's lots to be proud of in India, and it's not necessarily what you think it is. So maybe read this book and we'll get another perspective, at least for the next generation, maybe. Right?
Right.
Fair?
Thank you.
And we're so cheap at IVM, we only give him water. Man wrote for 5 years, we give him a 200 ml of water. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Got through both.
Yeah. Oh, two. William.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was fun.